The existence of weirwoods in Westeros and all of the magic that comes with them is something that's had a massive effect on society over the ages and how all of the world is structured. One of the main things I've talked about on my channel is how the entire old ways are structured around the weirwoods and the magical power that's possessed within them. And basically, all of the human sacrifice to the weirwoods and just everything that comes along with the old ways is all essentially a product of the weirwoods existing and, on some level or another, controlling society. So that makes sense, though, on a surface level. If you have a magical power that's very evident in your world, of course religions are going to spring up around it. But when you get to the deepest level and actually look at the power that these weirwoods possess, it raises a really interesting question. Can you have free will in a world that has weirwoods? Does the existence of weirwoods and the powers that they possess break the ability to have free will in this world? There's certainly an argument that it could, and we're going to look at what those powers are and why it's such an interesting discussion, as well as take a look at some examples from the books, Game of Thrones, and House of the Dragon, to try and figure out, do people actually have free will in this universe, or are the weirwoods just controlling everything? So, just as a quick refresher of some of the relevant Weirwood powers, they seem to be able to stand outside of time on some level or another, as well as send dreams and visions to people. They allow people to wed themselves to the trees, which seemingly would allow those people then to be the ones sending those dreams and visions, as well as viewing things outside of their own time. Even beyond that, though, they allow people to warg. This seemingly is an old god's power that comes from the worship of the Weirwoods. So, the ability to jump your consciousness into the consciousness of another being and take it over. This is definitely the power that comes the closest to brushing up against free will, and it's something that we'll have to talk about in this video. Bran's ability to warg into Hodor is definitely the most significant thing that points towards potentially Weirwoods taking away the ability for people to have free will. If there's an entity out there in the world that has this power that Bran seems to have, can you really ever truly have free will? We'll get to Hodor later on in the video, but first I want to talk about what's brought up this conversation most recently. So, the reason that this has come up recently, and I think it's a good time to talk about it, is because of something that happened in the season finale of House of the Dragon. Daemon was very clearly trying to decide whether he was going to side with Rhaenyra or try Crown himself. And then he has his vision that is sort of the culmination of his whole, like, haunted Harrenhal Weirwood arc, and his vision shows him the future, and basically afterwards he is fully committed to Rhaenyra. One of the complaints that I've seen around in the wake of this episode is people saying that this basically broke Daemon's free will. What was the point of him being conflicted within himself if he's just going to have all of that conflict resolved by a big magical vision that tells him what to do? So, in terms of the whole Daemon vision thing, I really don't understand the argument that people are making where they say that this affects his free will on any level. It just doesn't seem to do that at all to me. I understand if you want to say that this isn't your favorite method of conflict resolution, and if perhaps he should have resolved this inner conflict in a different way, that's a fair criticism and a conversation we can have, but right now we're talking about his free will, and I don't think that that was broken at all. So, what I want to kind of try to do to explain this is just put it into our real world terms, right? Also, for this hypothetical, you're going to put yourself in the position of someone who is in our world having all of the magical power to send these visions in the same way that the Weirwoods do. Oh, and we're also going to assume that you think we have free will in the real world. Because, if you don't think we have free will in real life, you probably wouldn't think they would have it in a book series. Like, that would be kind of weird for you to assume that they would have free will in a book series if you don't think it exists at all. So, okay, we're in our world. You are time traveling Bran or Bloodraven, whatever you want to say, in charge of the Weirwood, and you have the ability to send people dreams, but you don't want to or can't, one or the other, break their free will. So let's remember exactly what was done to Daemon. He had a choice that he was trying to make one way or the other, and he was shown visions of cataclysms in the far future that influenced his choice in one direction. We have to assume that this was done because the vision sender, whoever it is, favors the timeline where Daemon doesn't try to crown himself and instead sides with Rhaenyra. For our real world example, let's just assume that you're in a far future where there is someone who has invented a cure for cancer, and you have this time traveling ability magically for whatever reason, and let's say you're going back through the timeline and looking at all of their ancestors just to see what sort of lives they lived. You happen to notice that one of their ancestors is living in a city that in wartime gets completely wiped out. Maybe it's bombed really terribly, or it's invaded by a foreign army and there's no survivors, whatever it is, right? You have knowledge of the timeline that in 2 months, the city that this person lives in will be completely wiped out. Yet hey, wait a minute, they need to survive in order for the timeline to work out. I need them to make a choice to get the heck out of here. So the question now becomes, would showing these people visions of their town being destroyed in their dreams every night, for as long as it takes to get them to move out of there, would that be breaking their free will, or would that just be perfectly in line with a world that still has free will and the powers that these weirwoods possess? Because to me, that's exactly what happened with Damon. He was just shown a dream that influenced him to make a choice that would be no different from you showing someone a dream of their town being wiped out, and eventually, just because of having this dream over and over again, they decide, you know what? I think I'm going to decide to move. This doesn't feel like you've broken their free will at all, and it feels even less like you have if they were already considering whether or not they should move, and then you started sending them dreams. Damon was already considering whether he should support Rhaenyra or crown himself. So sending some dreams that influence him to crown Rhaenyra instead, well, that's not really breaking his free will in my opinion. So, in terms of that one specific criticism of that whole Damon arc and the vision scene and how it was sort of a major part of his conflict resolution, well, I really don't think it breaks his free will. I'm not saying that that's the only criticism of that scene or anything like that, but I did just want to give my take on that specific criticism. I don't think that it has anything to do with breaking free will in Westeros. I do think, however, as I've said in the past, the conversation of free will in Westeros is a really interesting one. So, if you have any thoughts on Damon or any of the things that I just brought up, let me know down in the comments if maybe there's something I've missed or anything that has come to your mind about that. But let's move on now to talking about what we saw happen in Game of Thrones, what Bran did to Hodor. Now, the Hodoring itself is obviously the most climactic and important event, probably in regards to free will in Westeros. Something that Bran did magically seems to have completely broken Hodor's mind. And Bran overall has the ability to warg into Hodor and essentially break his free will and take over for himself. The existence of this power and how we see it applied to Hodor basically sort of just tells us that free will only exists if the gods don't select you and choose to take it away from you. That seems to be at least what happened to Hodor. The problem is, all discussions about this have to come with the grain of salt that we have to be completely speculative. We don't know how this is going to play out in the books. We do know something very similar is going to happen. George has basically revealed as much, saying that yes, Hodor does mean hold the door, but we don't actually know what will break Hodor's mind. I think that once we see the way that Hodor plays out in the books and how Bran turns him into Hodor and how Bran reacts to that, we're going to have a lot of these questions answered towards what exactly is going on with free will in these books and what George is trying to play with. In the show, we saw that Bran was obviously pretty horrified about what he had done to Hodor, and I think that in the books it will probably be pretty similar. The reason this will be important is because Bran is ascending to godhood. He is very clearly gaining all of these old godsy magical powers and soon will be the one in charge of this system. And I think that he's being set up to be the Bran the Builder for a new similar looking system, but a better designed one for a new age of the world. So if Bran is going to be the one who's in charge of this entire system, and he loves Hodor, and he's horrified by seeing the results of this magical system used on someone he loves, and he realizes that he's at fault, well, he's going to feel incredibly guilty, and he's going to want nothing to do with that. I've talked a lot about in the past how I think Bran is going to have to work towards destroying this Weirwood system. I've also talked in the past about how if these weirwoods can influence things by standing outside of time, well, if you can destroy the entire system and you're the last person who's in charge of it, you can essentially go back into the past and influence everything you want to, and then you destroy the entire system, which will make your influence permanent. You would take away the ability for anyone else to ever access this ability to influence ever again, and therefore you could set the world on a new path that you wanted. The reason that this could work permanently is because even if someone were able to create another Weirwood system, they wouldn't be able to use that system to go back and view things that the old system saw. Because of the way the Weirwoods seem to work, I would think that destroying it and being the last one in charge would allow you to be the one who has complete influence over everything that Weirwood system saw. If Bran is the one who's in control of this Weirwood system, and he chooses not to take over everyone's free will, and he's the last one in control of the system, he gives everyone their free will by not influencing them because he's seen what it's done to Hodor and he says, I'm never doing that again. So, by Bran's own choice, he limits himself to the dream sending influence that we already explained allows people to keep their free will, and he just decides he has to deal with that. It's not worth breaking any more people the way he broke Hodor, so he's just going to influence the timeline through dreams. As I've mentioned in the past, these could be the dreams for spring. The dreams that Bran sends out to influence the timeline so that spring does one day come. That could be exactly what we've seen with Daemon. If that's actually how the system works and that's what Bran is doing, well, then that answers your question of how you can have free will in a world where weirwoods exist. The person who's in charge of the weirwoods at the end is Bran. He chooses not to use that power to break free will, and then destroys the ability to use it for anyone in the future. This would mean that Bran's story, his literal ascension to godhood, will include the part where God grants free will to the people. This is what George is showing us in this sort of creation of the new age for Westeros if the story goes the way that I think it's planned to go. So now we have to bring up the one other thing that happened in House of the Dragon that I'm sure some of you may be screaming about because we haven't brought it up. The conversation between Aemond and Helena. And we will definitely have to get a little bit into spoilers potentially for House of the Dragon for this one. Half of the spoilers were things that Helena just straight up said in that scene, and half will be things that I'm just going to have to talk about if I want to make sense of some of the things that we saw. So this is your spoiler warning for the last little bit of this video. Major spoilers for the end of House of the Dragon coming up. Now, after I do a little vocal filibustering so that they can navigate away, I think it's time that we talk about how Helena basically came out and said that the entire thing is a story, and when Aemon threatened to kill her, she said that it wouldn't change anything. Now, this one definitely does deliver a pretty big blow to the idea of having free will if Helena's literally saying, hey, I can see the future, whatever you do isn't going to change anything. But note that Helena doesn't say that Aemon won't throw her off the edge. She does seem to imply that he does have the free will to do so, just that him doing so in the grand scheme of things isn't going to change anything. I think that's what she's talking about. She's talking about in the big picture, there are certain events that are destined to happen, and your choices aren't going to be able to change certain things. It's also entirely possible that just given the type of person that Aemond is, his fate is already sealed by the choices that he will for sure make. Because he has the choice to be prideful and try and go fight Daemon, he will go and do that, and that will lead to the battle over the God's Eye. It's a choice that he will make, but it is sort of just going to happen because of the type of person that Aemond already is. So that's how I would kind of read that portion of what Helena's saying in terms of it won't change anything, right? Like, imagine, as I said in the earlier example, if you were trying to get someone out of a city that they lived in because you knew it was going to be bombed. Let's say it was, hit by an atomic bomb. Well, just because humanity wasn't able to prevent the atomic bomb from being invented doesn't mean that we didn't have free will, right? Like, if you went back in time 100 years, you on your own with your free will probably wouldn't be able to prevent the atomic bomb from being invented. It's just like a scientific discovery that humanity will eventually make if we keep advancing. So, on some level, whatever you do won't change anything. But you still do have free will. I think that's what Helena's basically saying to Aemond. Also, more spoilers here coming, but we're already past the warning. Obviously, Helena does eventually jump from a very similar balcony, so him throwing her from the balcony or her jumping from the balcony, maybe on some level she's also saying, wouldn't really change anything. Now, the other really interesting thing she brought up was when she said that this was all a story, and we'll talk about that right after we talk about one other thing that I talked about last video, which was the little back and forth between Jojen and Mira about how the green dreams don't lie. This is a very similar thing to Helena saying it won't change anything. Jojen is telling Mira he can't fight his fate in the green dreams when they showed him how he's going to die, he's just accepted that that's how he's going to die. In case you haven't watched last video, I made the case that this also doesn't break free will. I think it's more likely what's going on here is Jojen has been shown that his role is going to involve his death, but he's willingly self-sacrificing because that's important for what needs to happen. If you want the full explanation, I think I just did a satisfying job of it last video, so I'm not going to go into the whole, like, little shorter version of it here. You can just go check that out. But basically, I do think that the back and forth between Jojen and Mira can be explained away in a world where Jojen does have the free will to avoid his fate, but he's already chosen that this is what he's going to do. He's going to go through with it. So he's just telling Mira, hey, it's already set, this is the way things are going to be, because he doesn't want her constantly fighting and thinking there's a chance to convince him out of it. So these are my thoughts on a lot of the examples that most directly deal with free will, both in the shows and in the books that we've seen so far. I really do think that it's pretty likely that all of these characters do have free will, and if we don't have it directly confirmed later on in the story, I do think it's already mostly implied. And I think it's really implied by some of the things that George has said about his writing process. How he's constantly trying to get characters to do the things that he wants to, but they have a mind of their own. This pretty directly states that they do have free will, and I don't think it's any accident that Bran's sort of way that he can manipulate people very indirectly by just nudging them in the direction that he wants to, and then hoping they choose to do the right thing. I think that mirrors the way that George has to deal with his characters on purpose. I think he's doing something there on purpose, and he's making a statement about his relationship with his characters when you're trying to write characters that actually feel like real people with free will. So I would say that overall, the evidence is very strong that these characters do have free will. There are many lines in the story that also directly refer to the choices that characters are making and how important that they are. I don't think that House of the Dragon really messed anything up here by having the Weirwoods influence Daemon the way they did, or having Helena say that all of this is just a story and Aemon throwing her off the balcony wouldn't change anything. I think that the way that this was presented is all pretty much in line with what George has done in his books so far, and I think these are questions we should be asking. I think George is definitely going to be playing with the idea of free will with Bran and Hodor, the whole idea of warging, especially warging another person, and just the Weirwoods in general definitely raise a lot of these questions. We're going to have to wait for future books to get firm answers on what exactly George is going to do with all of this, but I'd like to hear all of your thoughts you have on anything that I've talked about in this video down there in the comments. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching to the end. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll be back with something else very soon.